Well, good morning, Foothills. It's so good to be back up here sharing with you. I had to laugh after the first service. This guy came up to me and he was telling me about his daughter. She saw that I was up here speaking and she's like, got all excited. She's probably 8 years old and she's like, that's the Christian Tingle guy. I was like, oh my gosh, that's what I'm known for around here is Christian Tingle. Yeah, it's good to be back. I just shameless, got to do a couple announcements. Busy week in FSM. If you are a high schooler or a parent of a high schooler, after this service, we're having an information meeting in FSM about our summer mission trip to Seattle. So if you want to learn more about that, no commitment, just showing up at the meeting, that would be awesome. And to my middle schoolers, this Wednesday is the last day you can sign up for our winter camp. So we've got a few more spots available for that. So there's that. It's crazy to me, guys, that it has been 2 years. I recently celebrated 2 years having moved to Malala, and that is crazy. It seems like it was just yesterday we were in the U-Haul coming back to Malala. And for those who don't know me, I moved here 2 years ago from Michigan. I lived in the suburbs of Detroit. It's not as scary as you may think in suburban Detroit. And though I don't assume all of you know what suburbia is like, so it's just like Big Meadow, you know, the housing development over here. It's like 1,000 of those with like an Applebee's on every corner and Outback Steakhouse. That's suburbia, okay? That's what I grew up in. So this is by far the smallest town that I have ever lived in. So it's taking some getting used to. I mean, again, we have a Facebook page for our town. Like you don't have that in suburbia. So it's taken some getting used to. There's a lot of similarities, believe it or not, but some differences. And one of the differences that surprised me is the driving around here. From suburban Detroit to here is pretty different. And it's basically like you all don't drive the speed limit. Like everybody around here either drives 10 or 20 below the speed limit or like 10 above. Do you know what I'm saying? Like it just seems like everybody around here does not go near the speed limit for some reason. And, there's fast and slow drivers in Michigan too, but we have more lanes to get around them, like 4-lane roads kind of thing. These 2-lane roads drive me crazy. Just the other day coming back from Oregon City to Malala on 213, do you realize there's no passing lane? Have you noticed that on the way back? So if you get behind somebody who's doing 20 under, it's going to be a while before you see Malala. And so that drives me crazy. But have you noticed there's something about driving that brings anger to the surface? Like, am I the only one? I didn't think I had an anger issue until I was 16 and I got my license, and it's like, whoa, like I have anger issues. There's something about driving. One time I was driving back to a church I was working at in Michigan, and this guy was riding my bumper, okay, like right on my tail, like in my back seat kind of thing. I didn't even know the guy. He's just like, hey, how you doing? So he's riding my rear end. And normally I'm the guy, like I can understand tailgating if you're behind somebody doing, again, 20 under and you can't get around them. The point of tailgating is sending a signal like, yo, there's other people on the planet than you. You need to speed up kind of thing. I got to get home and watch Kaleidoscope or something. But so it's okay, but I'm going 5 over the speed limit. So this is completely uncalled for that this guy is riding my tail. And so I did the only reasonable thing you do in that situation. I squirrel braked him. Do you guys call it squirrel braking here? Is that not the term, like brake checking? Okay. So I prefer squirrel braking because it's like, I fake there's a squirrel, I got to stop. It brings another being into it. I can blame it. So I squirrel braked him, and to the parents, just as a disclaimer, you have teen drivers. I'm not condoning this behavior. This is an illustration to start my talk off, okay? There are things in the Bible you wouldn't allow your kids to do. It doesn't condone everything that's contained in it, so there's my disclaimer. So back to Tailgater dude. He was not happy that I decided to show him that I existed, and so he proceeded to whip around me and get in front of me, and return the favor. So he brake checks me, right? Again, this is kind of a common thing, unfortunately. And at this point, I'm like, game over. Like, I work at a church. Like, I'm done. I already shouldn't have squirrel brake you. I feel guilty about that. And so I back way off. But this guy stops in the middle of the road. Like, he comes to a complete stop. And this is a rare 2-lane road in Michigan, so cars are coming by. I'm just like, well, what do we do now? Like, I can't get around you. He stopped the car. He gets out of his car and starts walking back to my car. Like, this is the only time in my life, then and now, that somebody had got out of the car. Like, this is on, like, what the heck am I about to encounter? And I don't know if you've been in a situation where your adrenaline starts getting pumping, but it's just like in the movies. Time slows down. Like, everything just slowed down. I'm like, whoa, I'm in a trippy, like, different world. And I noticed 2 things that were odd about this guy walking back to me. The first one is that he had both arms behind his back. So he has something in his hands, and I didn't see an Amazon logo. I don't think he's delivering a lost package or, he had a gift to give me. Like, I didn't want to find out what was behind his back. I'm like, no thanks, bro. And the second thing I noticed is that I expected there to be like, frowed eyebrows, red face. This guy had zero emotion. Okay, like just stone cold, just walking back to my car. And I'm like, dude, if I knew I brake checked Jeffrey Dahmer, I would not have done that. Like, this guy's gonna murder me and they're gonna have to announce it at church on Sunday. Like, no way is this about to happen. Well, thank God, and I do think, looking back, God was involved, because traffic opened up and I was able to hit the gas and just get around this guy, and not surprisingly took a different way back to the church and never ran into Jeffrey again. But anger can be a scary emotion, as we see from examples like this. Like, when you think about emotions, what other emotions would drive 2 adult men to act like that on a road, right? Not happiness. You're not going to do that when you're happy. You're not going to do that when you're sad. You do that when you're angry. And flipping on the news, this happens daily in our world, unfortunately, these kind of angry encounters. And a lot of times with outcomes that are much worse, that end up in a hospital or end up in a graveyard, right? Growing up, I don't remember being taught much about anger. It just was one of those things we didn't really have discussions about or talked about. But looking back, I now see that I internalized it as only being associated with violence, right? Like, anger to me was equal to violence. It was only ever connected with violent acts. And so for this reason, most of my life, I either pretended I was never angry or I stuffed it inside, and never really learned how to express it appropriately. This verse from Psalm 37 would have summed up my entire theology of anger. It says this in verse 8 of chapter 37. It says, "Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil." So that would have been my whole idea, is like, just, nope, don't deal with anger. It only leads to evil. It only leads to guys acting crazy on a road. Like, just don't go there. But that's not all that God has to say on anger. We have to get a fuller picture of what God has to say about this topic. And it might be a refreshing concept for some today that God actually designed you to experience anger. He's not only okay with you feeling angry, that might be the exact emotion he wants you to feel in a particular situation. That's, again, what we're going to look at today. So enough about me and my crazy story. What makes you angry? Like, really angry? Can you think about the last time you were angry? Maybe for some of you it was this morning, right? Wrangling the kids to get into the van, yelling at your teenager, I don't know, your spouse. Like, maybe even this morning you're like, dang it, they're talking about anger. We've already dealt with anger. God is absolutely okay with us getting angry, but he's set up some guardrails to protect us from getting into a wreck, from unnecessary pain. And that's why we're in this series, Guardrails. Sam talked last week, if you didn't get a chance to hear it online, talked about fear. And so today, we're talking about anger and staying within those guardrails. So let's have some fun today. I want to share with you 3 guardrails that we should have in our lives so we can experience anger and not get into a wreck. So the first one is this, guardrail number 1, don't sin. Don't sin. Psalm verse 4 says it very clearly. It says, "Be angry and do not sin. Ponder in your own hearts on your beds and be silent." Be angry and don't sin. Do you hear the permission in that verse? Like, it's literally telling us, be angry. It's almost like a command, be angry. I mean, it couldn't be more clear. We can be angry, but when we express it, we don't get a free pass to sin. I think sometimes with anger, we're like, well, you made me emotional. I can now sin. Like, I can now have an excuse, a free pass. And this has been my prayer as I've been preparing this talk today over the last month, is that some of you would feel permission to be angry. I think as Christians, again, we sometimes get messed up in these kind of topics, and you maybe feel guilty, or you just feel like I shouldn't be angry because I'm a Christian or whatnot. It's something that God wouldn't want for you. And so I want some of you to feel a permission today. That's been my prayer. Did you guys know that the Bible records a few times that Jesus himself, Jesus Christ, got angry? A passage recorded by John kind of blows up the meek and mild Jesus that we often see in shows like The Chosen or a Christmas production, right? It's always this like, I'm Jesus. And it's like he's never going to get angry or show that kind of emotion. Well, check out John chapter 2. It records a situation where that happened. Check this out. It says, when it was almost time for the Jewish Passover, Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple courts, he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and others sitting at tables exchanging money. So he made a whip out of cords and drove all from the temple courts, both sheep and cattle. He scattered the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. Jesus was ticked off when he showed up at the temple. And again, you need to know the context and the backstory. He showed up there, and this was his father's house. This was his house, God and Abad. Like, this is his deal. And what he found was people were making a mockery of it. They were making money off of it. They were corrupt. They were taking money off the top. And so it turned his stomach, made him angry. And that was how he responded. And so was Jesus angry? Yes. Did he sin? No. And it's really important, again, side note, that our Jesus, the Jesus that we worship, is sinless. Like, that's a bedrock important piece. We have to have a sinless Savior. Otherwise, we should just pack up foothills and call it a day. Like, Jesus has to be sinless for this faith thing to work, faith in him. So I'm not suggesting tomorrow at work when you're there and your boss is getting frustrated that you throw over a couple tables, right? Like, that's not going to end well. You're going to be looking for a new job. Amazon's hiring, right? But I'm showing you a really important principle, is that the leader of our movement, the leader of our church, got angry. Jesus Christ experienced the emotion of anger. So clearly there are situations that we can be angry and not sin. Right? We talk a lot about Jesus being our model, Jesus being the one we follow. He also got angry. So if you feel angry at times, that's a good thing. Part of what makes us human is that we feel things, that we experience that emotion. It's important, however, that we learn how to express our anger without sinning in the process. And while I'm glad I didn't find out what was behind that guy's back, I'm assuming that my squirrel breaking was going to lead that man to commit some sins that day. So guardrail number 1, we can be angry, but we do not sin. Guardrail number 2, deal with it quickly. Deal with it quickly. For me, I don't know about you, but this is not how I dealt with anger. I think a majority of us don't deal with it quickly. We tend to bury it. We pretend it doesn't bother us. And then we hold grudges against people, right? And that leads to explosions later on. Years ago, when I taught a variation of this talk on anger with students, I used an illustration that I thought would be perfect for the talk today, but it can get a little bit messy, and I thought about doing it up here, but again, it would involve cleaning up and time and stuff. So a couple weeks ago at our middle school group, we decided to do this as one of the games. And so check out this video clip, and then we'll talk about it.
Try to get as much in your mouth as humanly possible so that we get a good reaction. Otherwise, it's not really fair to the other contestants. All right, so on the count of 3, you're going to put the Alka-Seltzer tablet in your mouth, and you're going to drink as much, not drink. Put the liquid in your mouth, don't drink, as much as possible. Hold it in your mouth as long as possible. And again, when you spit it out in the bag. So on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3. Try to go as long as you can. As long as you can. Go! Shane. Hold it in. Good job, guys. I think we have time for one more round.
Now, you may think we torture kids at FSM, but they did that. They did that fully knowing what they were doing. But that was Ryan. He's an awesome volunteer, our games leader there. And if you didn't catch it, we took Alka-Seltzer tabs and mixed it with 7-Up, and they put that in their mouth. And there's a chemical reaction that creates this like ever-expanding like foam. And so it was a race there of like who could hold it in the longest. And I just think what a perfect visual of what happens when we try and hold on to our anger. When we try to keep it in, that's the tendency of anger, as it starts to expand and get bigger. And you've maybe bought the lie that it's better left unsaid, or just forget about it. You know, don't make mountains out of molehills, or whatever lame advice you've been given about anger. Paul, in his letter to the Ephesians, gives us a great time frame, a great concept on how to keep our anger in check. And again, Paul is a pastor. He's writing to a church just like in our town at Ephesus, and they're dealing with angry people. They have anger issues. Surprise, surprise. In the Bible, people had anger issues. And so look at how this pastor gave some advice to his flock. In Ephesians 4, verse 26, it says, "In your anger, do not sin." He's quoting the Psalms. "Do not let the sun go down while you are still angry, and do not give the devil a foothold." Man, I wonder how much better this year would go, 2023, if we just followed that one principle. If you only take this away from today's conversation, that not letting our anger go into the next day or the next week or the next month, that we actually just deal with everything in each day. Don't let the sun go down without dealing with it, and talk about it, let it out, journal about it, acknowledge that it exists. For some of us, just acknowledging how we feel is such a big and freeing thing, because for the majority of my life, I did the opposite. I just acted like it didn't exist. I'm really not angry. I just told myself it wasn't a big deal. Just ignore it. Just move on. And I don't think that's good for our physical or mental health, to pretend things don't exist or to push them down. Lots of health conditions are linked with suppressed negative emotions. And some of you are experiencing that today. You have health conditions and you have things that the doctors haven't been able to figure out. I wonder if there's something here. I wonder if it's connected to something that you've suppressed or pushed down over the course of your life. Have you ever heard the saying that time heals all wounds? Is that something somebody told you along the way? Well, that's just crap. Can we say that at church? Like, it's crap, right? I mean, ask an ER nurse if time heals all wounds, right? You come in with a gaping wound and they're just like, hey, let's prescribe them some time. Like, no, that's not a good philosophy to live by. The longer we let time pass, the worse it becomes in our heads, right? We just kind of do this mental game and we end up thinking, what wasn't a big deal ends up becoming a pretty big deal. It starts building bitterness and resentment, and we find ways, if we're the one at fault, to justify our behavior and deceive ourselves into thinking, oh, the other person's in the wrong. They need to start the process of repair. I can't tell you how many times I've heard that as a pastor. It's like, well, I'm just waiting on them. And it's like, okay, well, nothing's going to change because you're not taking any action. Some of you have just experienced another Christmas with without someone at the Christmas table. And I'm not saying because they passed away. I'm saying because you're holding a grudge or they're holding a grudge, right? Like you no longer talk to each other. They aren't invited anymore to Christmas. And maybe years have passed and you just don't know how to come back from that. I think this is kind of what Paul was getting at by saying not giving the devil a foothold in your relationships, right? Like if we just let these things build up over time, it wasn't a little issue, and now they're not invited to the family holiday, like now they're excluded from your family. Remember, God's goal is always unity. It's always reconciliation. The enemy of our soul, the devil, his goal is the opposite, to divide and to separate and to destroy. And starts right in our homes, between spouses, between parents and kids. It's in our towns. It's in our state, in our nation. Man, have we ever lived through a time that has more division and more separate, broken relationships? And with that anger, like we're seeing that all over our country. Before we share the final guardrail, I want to park here for a moment and acknowledge that some of you this morning, I think God is calling, dare I say, commanding some of you to take the first step today in restoring a relationship. Restoring that broken relationship. And what would that look like? Again, I'm saying taking the first step. This isn't going to solve it overnight. It's not going to suddenly be, your best friends again. But what would it look like? I think for some of you, there might be a broken relationship in this room. You all look good from up here, but I know there's hurt. I know there's pain. I know there's stuff going on in the church. Maybe during the last worship song, you walk across the room and give someone a hug. Again, starting the process of reconciliation. Maybe for some of you, it means before you hit 211 that you send a text or you call someone that you haven't talked to in years and you say, hey, I heard this message, throw me under the bus. There's this bald guy who's talking to us. I need to call you. However you need to do it, make the call so that this Christmas you see them at the Christmas table. That's God's desire, is for us to be together. Don't let the sun set before you've taken a step to repair that broken relationship. That's Paul's wisdom. Let's deal with it today. If we put it off, there's still time. All right, guardrail 1, don't sin. Guardrail 2, deal with it quickly. And our final guardrail 3, don't let it get out of control. Don't let it get out of control. One of the hardest jobs I took early on in my career was at an inpatient residential treatment center for adolescents. That's a mouthful. That's a big job. And for those not familiar, these are the places where students age 8 to 18 would live for a period of time, and they weren't allowed to leave. Okay, these are often kids who had a violent outburst at school, like pulling a knife on a teacher kind of thing, or abused someone or had been abused. I mean, these are really kind of rough kids and had a rough life situation. And most stay there for a shorter period of time, like 30, 60 days, while the court decides their future. And I thought I was ready for this kind of job. I was 20 years old. God was kind of beginning, calling me to work with teens, with students, and I really wanted to make a difference. And my friend worked there, and he really talked it up, and I'm like, all right, I'm down. Like, let's do this. Let's make a difference. And I quit after just 6 months of working there. Like, it was the shortest duration, I think, ever I worked at a place. And one story just to illustrate why I quit, why it was overwhelming, is I remember one lunch, we're there in the lunchroom, and probably 10 kids or so and 4 adults, and it seemed like everything was going fine. We're having lunch with these kids, we're making conversation, and next thing I know, this kid stands up and throws his chair across the table at one of the other kids, striking him like dead in the face, right? Like, just whoa. And this kind of situation set into a series of events that the staff, me, I'm one of them, were trained for. And basically everybody's sent back to their rooms. Their doors are locked. They have to stay in their rooms. And then if the young man is not able to be calmed down with words, we then would be forced to physically restrain him and carry him to a padded room so that he would, again, calm down as time passed. And that was the hardest part of the job. Like, it was just did something to me and did something to most who worked there when you had to physically restrain someone. And while this may seem extreme, it was done to protect this young guy and to protect those around him. I learned later when we were doing the debrief, again, I'd never seen something like this freaked me out. And we debriefed it, and the kid shared that he had blacked out. So he didn't remember anything that happened in the lunchroom. It was completely like memory wipe kind of thing. He had no concept of it. And it made me think of Proverbs chapter 29, verse 11. FSM, we're beginning the year off talking about wisdom, and we're kind of parked in Proverbs. And so this is King Solomon. This is one of his pieces of wisdom. And he says this, he says, "Fools give full vent to their rage, but the wise bring calm in the end." Fools, he calls us fools if we give full vent, if we just let our rage, we just let that anger just get out of control. Solomon calls us fools. And one of the hardest lessons those kids had to learn was that they're responsible for the effect of their anger. Like, that's one of those, when their anger gets out of control, they have to be held responsible for it. We kept track of even the cost of them like punching a hole in the wall or breaking something in the room. Like we tallied all that up, and then when they left, their parents would get a bill and like, here, you and your loved one have to pay for this. And this may seem not compassionate to you, again, given that these are tough kids in tough situations, but I assure you that it is, because being accountable for our actions is important. It's essential to being happy and healthy adults. We have to take responsibility for our actions. And besides, it's a lot cheaper to fix broken drywall than it is to fix a broken life later. So what about you? Maybe you're sitting here and you're like, Kurt, I don't black out due to my anger. But I think there's some of you that if you're honest today, there's a lot of people hurt and wounded when you get angry, that you kind of leave people in your wake. There's kind of just all this brokenness when you have these kind of angry moments. I love how one dad taught his son about the lasting effects of anger. You may have heard this story. It's called The Fence. I'm going to read it for you. But it's, again, a great metaphor to get us thinking about the effects of our anger that we might not consider. There once was a little boy who had a bad temper. His father gave him a bag of nails and told him that every time he lost his temper, he must hammer a nail into the back of a fence. The first day, the boy had driven 37 nails into the fence. This kid had a temper. Over the next few weeks, he learned how to control his anger. The number of nails hammered daily gradually dwindled down. He discovered it was easier to hold his temper than to drive those nails into the fence. Finally, the day came when the boy didn't lose his temper at all. He told his father about it, and the father suggested that the boy now pull out one nail for each day that he was able to control his anger. The days passed, and the young boy was finally able to tell his father that all the nails were gone. He was super excited. The father took his son by the hand and led him to the fence and said, "You've done well, my son, but look at the holes in the fence. The fence will never be the same. When you say things in anger, they leave a scar just like this one. You can put a knife into a man and draw it out. It won't matter how many times you say, 'I'm sorry,' the wound is still there. A verbal wound can be just as bad as a physical one." Isn't that a good picture to get us thinking about the effects of our anger and how it lasts generations sometimes? Okay, what now? Let's pressure release here. Like some of y'all, I can feel it. You're angry. This talk's making you angry. You're like, when's lunch? Get me out of here. He knows me. He knows I deal with anger. So I just want to share practical advice, 3 practical ways that you can, if you acknowledge you or someone you love deal with anger, here's some things that you may find helpful. So the first one, again, just practical, is get help. Get help, okay? A counselor was super helpful for me in identifying and dealing with anger. We kept it pretty simple today. We're talking about a pretty complex emotion, and there's a lot of things under the surface, sometimes subconscious, that make you angry, that kind of bring that up when you're driving or when your spouse pushes your buttons. Like sometimes that stuff comes from a place that you're not able to navigate. You don't know why it is. And so if at times it feels like you can't control your anger, I highly recommend don't waste another day. Reach out to a counselor for help. And you could also begin today by asking a member of our prayer team to pray for you, right? We have a prayer team at the end of the service, every service, and just walking up to another brother or sister in Christ and saying, "Yeah, I deal with anger. Would you pray for me?" That's a great first step. That's a great first step of admitting it and seeking help. So the first step, get help. Second is develop patience. Develop patience. And this may seem weird on the surface to develop patience connected to anger. For many years, I taught a series in youth group called The 7 Deadly Sins, taken from our Catholic brothers and sisters. And before you all write me an email, I know we're not a Catholic church. We have differences in our theology. But the 7 deadly sins are often misunderstood. They're not saying that these are worse sins or you're going to get in bigger trouble with God. It's these sins have a way of deadening your spiritual walk and hanging on more so than other sins. So they've kind of just collected these 7 categories as being significant. And you when you get involved in these sins, they just have a harder time of us shaking them. And what many don't know is for each of the 7 deadly sins, there was also a virtue that they would say, practice this, and it would help you overcome that particular deadly sin. And so wrath or uncontrolled anger is one of the 7 deadly sins. And the virtue for wrath is patience. Patience is the virtue that if you seek to live that out in your life, you're going to notice anger start to lose its deadening power. And so I encourage you to think of ways to develop patience in your life. And just practical ideas of, you could come up with some on your own, but I was thinking, when you go to Safeway, for example, we're always looking for the shortest line. We're racing through the self-checkout. What if you intentionally pick the longest line, right? And I know it sounds crazy, but it will develop patience in you that you have to sit there longer. You have to stand in line, read a magazine, talk to the person to your left or right. You might be surprised at other people exist in that long line. So that's an example. And for those of us who struggle on the roads, as I've already confessed to you, how about going the speed limit? How about staying in the right lane, right? Like, it's not a video game. You don't have to see how many people you can pass to get to town. You're not, leave earlier if you're getting late or something. But I encourage you, seriously, try that for a period of time. What do you have to lose, right? Like, try that or come up with other examples, develop patience, see if your anger issue lessens, right? Finally, final piece of advice, again, if you deal with anger or someone you love, admit when you fail and ask for forgiveness. This one's a great principle in pretty much every aspect, but speaking specifically of anger, we're going to fail, right? Like, if you acknowledge it today, you're like, cool, God, I'm praying about it, I'm going to make that call. You're still going to have an outburst. You're still going to have moments where you experience negative aspects of anger. So who do you need to ask forgiveness for how you acted in anger? We'd all prefer someone else to make the first move. Maybe you're connecting with that. You're always waiting for someone else. But God has handed the assignment to us. It's our assignment as believers. It's our assignment as Foothills. Let's make that first step. Don't miss the opportunity today brings without taking the first step. Few things bring God a bigger smile than watching his kids restore broken relationship. Don't you want to give God a smile? Don't you want to make God smile over us? May he give us courage to make the first move. I know it takes courage. I know some of you are already like, Kurt, it's not going to fix it. You don't know this person. Make the first step. God can lead you in that. And for those of you hurt by someone else's anger, I see you. I know you're sitting there and you're like, Kurt, I don't deal with anger. I'm the one who's been wounded. I'm the one who's the victim of a spouse or an ex or somebody in my family or somebody in my town that has hurt you, likely by not staying within those guardrails, right? They've let their anger get out of control. God has not forgotten you. There is hope. There is healing. He sees you. He's part of your life. Listen today to what he may be asking you to do. And in a minute, I want to pray for you, those hurt by anger, and I want to pray for us. Finally, as a good pastor up here talking about anger, I have to address an elephant in the room that sometimes we're angry with the man upstairs, right? Like, let's just call that out. When we're talking about anger, sometimes we're blaming God for something that happened years ago. And yeah, you come to church and you put on the face and you may sing a few lines of the song. But if you're honest sitting here today, you really have a grudge against God. You're holding him to something, maybe an unanswered prayer. You're like, I have been praying for years, and until you answer that prayer, I'm going to hold a grudge against you, right? Like, just acknowledge that. Like, have you ever thought about it like that? Like, just like a human relationship that puts distance between you, it makes it awkward to have conversations. Maybe that's where you're stuck in your relationship with God, is this grudge that you're holding. Let's be honest with him today and get our hearts right. What a better way, again, there's no better way to start 2023 than to do some of these things. So just as guardrails on roads were designed to protect us from pain or death, God has given us permission to feel anger, to be angry. And last week, as we talked about, to experience fear. But we've got to stay inside of his guardrails. We've got to stay inside of his boundaries if we want to avoid a wreck. And so let's seek to stay inside of them in 2023 and beyond. Because after all, guys, life goes better when we stay within God's guardrails, when we stay within the boundaries that he's created. The world will tell us the opposite. The world will try to drag us off the road and off track, but most of us have experienced a lot of pain when we've not stayed within God's boundaries and God's guardrails. So let's commit at the start of this new year to be the people that stick within. Life will go far better. I promise you that. So can I pray for you? God, thank you for this morning and just talking about anger. And I pray for those in this audience, God, those online who just acknowledge today, maybe just between you and them, that they deal with anger. God, I pray that you would motivate them, give them courage to get help. Some of them need counselors. Some of them needs just a friend, a buddy to talk to. God, I pray that they would admit it with you and with others. And God, today would be the beginning of a change in their heart, that you would start to soften their hard hearts. God, I pray for those today that are sitting there like that fence with a bunch of holes, with a bunch of wounds from things that were said to them, maybe many, many years ago by a dad or an uncle or a friend. God, I pray for those who have been hurt by anger. God, that you would again start the healing today. God, that you would give them that hope that they need, that you've not forgotten them, that you're present in their daily lives, that you're working out. Even today is evidence of that they're sitting here and hearing this message, that you acknowledge, that you see them, you love them. And God, finally, for those of us who just have kind of a grudge sometimes, we have this block in our relationship with you. We blame you, God, for something that you didn't do, God, that you weren't a part of, but yet we're upset and we're just kind of distant from you. God, I pray that that person would hear today that just because they didn't see you doesn't mean you weren't there. God, that you are present in our lives and you're a part of things. God, I pray that you would break that hard heart and help them to see that you're a God who wants close relationship with them. God, thank you for this church. Thank you for this new year and all the opportunity it brings. Help us to live inside of the guardrails that you've set up. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.